or good morning, wherever you may be joining us today. Thank you very much for joining us for this inaugural webinar of the political economy from the Global South. This webinar is being recorded, and it's also includes live interpretation, so simultaneous interpretation into Arabic. If you want to listen to the interpretation in Arabic, please check in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen of Zoom and click on the globe looking sign that says interpretation and choose the language you would like to listen in, either English or Arabic. في ترجمة باللغة العربية. إذا في حد محتاج لغة عربية يقدر إنه يستخدم الانتربريتيشن بوتن الموجود أو الزرار الموجود في أسفل الشاشة ويختار اللغة العربية أو الإنجليزية. So welcome everyone. My name is Ahmed Morsi. I'm a co-founder and the chair of the Arab Political Science Network. This network started back in 2019, and its main mission is engaging and working with graduate students and faculty members who focus on questions of politics and political science, particularly who are in the Arab world or are from the Arab world. Over the years, we have worked closely with different partner organizations and universities and think tanks in the region and elsewhere to run different types of workshops that engages graduate students to support the research outputs and also work with faculty members on questions of pedagogy and teaching. Over the past 3 years, we have been working closely to run these annual seminar series that looks at certain topics that tries to question or brings in the question of politics in our daily life. We have run seminar series on the politics of infrastructure. Last year, we ran a series on politics and war. And this year, we are excited to launch this series on political economy and the questions of politics that engages or looks at political economy from different vantage points. In this regard, we have a collaboration with the project of Pathways Beyond Neoliberalism, Voices from the Middle East and North Africa, which is based at the American University in Cairo. This is a research project that's not only focused on the MENA, but has partners across different countries, from South America, in Africa, in Asia. So it also tries to collectively work to bring in a different approach and critically kind of question political economy and all its subfields. So today we have this 4 speakers, moderator, colleagues who are going to run us through this session on what's political economy from the Global South. I'm sure there will be other questions that will come across. We're living in a world that's so precarious and full of a lot of uncertainty. So I look forward to their contribution. Finally, there will be an opportunity for the audience, for the participants here, to also field questions. So if you want to ask a question, there is the Q&A button, which is also available in the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom page. Please use it, send your questions, and my colleague Inji is going to field these questions as we develop that. Without further ado, let me introduce Inji briefly, and then she will moderate our conversation today. So Inji is an assistant professor of Middle East Studies and the research manager for Pathways Beyond Neoliberalism, our partner project today. And she has received her PhD in politics from the University of California in Santa Cruz, where she specialized in political economy, political theory, and urban geography. Her work is so much kind of overlapping with what we're discussing today, so I'm sure Inji's interests also will be featured in this conversation with Sean, Seth, and Amr. Thank you all, and I look forward to your contribution.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, for the introduction and for this promising collaboration. I'm excited to be joined by Amr Adli, Sean Stars, and Seth Schindler. And this is, as Ahmed mentioned, is at the heart of our work at Pathways. We are based at the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo. And we work as part of a global initiative that includes partner universities in the Global South, spanning India, South Africa, Mexico, and Colombia. And we try our best, being based in the Middle East and North Africa and focusing on the region, to examine these global connections, but also the relationship between our knowledge production, the alternative approaches to political economy that emanate from our region, but also from other parts of the world as well. Of course, as Ahmed mentioned, and I'm sure it's heavy on all our minds, this is a very rapidly changing world and a rapidly changing landscape. When we put together the plan for this webinar series and for this first inaugural discussion on what is political economy from the Global South, the war in the Gulf on Iran had not started yet. And of course, this makes a lot of the questions that we're going to pose today more urgent and more timely. And I look forward to hearing from our speakers, but also from the audience during our Q&A session. Without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers and then open the floor for their reflections. So I'm happy to be joined by Amr Adli, who's our principal investigator of Pathways Beyond Neoliberalism and who's an associate professor of political science at the American University in Cairo, who's a prolific writer on questions of political economy, development, and economic sociology in the Middle East. And he's the author of the widely read Cleft Capitalism, The Social Origins of Failed Market Making in Egypt. I'm also grateful for Seth Schindler, who is a professor of urban politics and development at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester, and whose research examines large-scale urban and regional transformation initiatives, and particularly how cities are integrated into global production networks amid shifting geopolitical dynamics. And he's also the co-founder of the Second Cold War Observatory. And we'd love to know more from you about the initiative, the work that you're doing, but also about the framework of the Second Cold War in tension with and in relation to current events. And last but not least, we're very happy to have Sean Kenji Stars, who's a lecturer in international development at King's College London, and whose research interests include the capitalist rise of China, US hegemony, world order, techno-nationalism, and East Asian political economy. He is widely cited in both academic and public forums, and who we've already had a very interesting, albeit short, exchange about the Global South and Global South political economy over email that we'd love to know more from you about. Okay, so I think we can start with the question of this webinar, the title: what is political economy from and for the Global South rather than about the Global South? Why do we need political economy from the Global South? Is it just because the Global South was distinctly globalized? And of course, the histories of this globalization and neoliberalization process in your perspective as it relates to the study of political economy. So we can start with Amr Adli, and we can take it on.
Well, thank you very much, Inji, for the rather flattering introduction. I hope that my contribution will live up to the introduction. Well, I think that the question of political economy is primarily a question of governance, but not necessarily in the liberal IR tradition of governance, which I think has always been optimistic about setting rules by which we can all play, but rather governance in the way that would reflect the hierarchical order that has persisted from earlier times of imperialism and formal colonial empires into the world of post-independence, even under the UN Charter. So that's when political economy can help us in understanding how these hierarchies have formed, how they have changed, because not all like countries and peoples have fared in the same way. But to a great extent, it is a question of governance, especially that the world in which we live nowadays is one that is going through a very severe crisis of governance, meaning that the rules, no matter how unfair or unjust they have been, are just like going away. And it seems that this opens it raises the questions about whether this is something that can be good for those who have not really benefited from these rules going away. But the problem, of course, is that the older hegemons are the ones that are pushing these rules away for their own interest in a very chaotic world that most probably the most vulnerable are going to pay for in all senses. So again, I think the key word is governance, but we just need to appropriate it for a critical political economy account.
Thank you so much. And absolutely, I mean, governance is a very fruitful starting point, although it's also among most complex conceptually and empirically. Sean, if you'd like to also provide us with an opening response.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. This is fantastic. And I speak almost as fast as Amir, so I'm going to try to speak slower for the benefit of the interpreter. But first, I just want to answer this question by saying what I don't think it is. So maybe a lot of people would interpret this from a standpoint epistemology perspective. So political economy from the global south means, you have to be from the global south and present a particular perspective from the global south. But obviously, awkward, I'm not from the global south. I'm sitting here in London, which is, of course, the imperial metropole, or at least a junior partner of the current US empire. And I've never lived in the global south. I lived in Hong Kong, but that was also a former British colony. So, but for me, that's not a problem because again, I reject standpoint epistemology, and I in favor of universalism. So so if we go back to the origins of political economy, let's say with Adam Smith and Karl Marx and so on, the basic idea for me is that we cannot analyze economics without politics, and we cannot analyze politics without economics. So we need to combine the two. And for me, the heart of it, for a critical political economy, is that we have to understand unequal power relations. We have to identify unequal power relations, and we have to analyze them. And the critical part is we have to challenge them. So if I'm going to think about political economy from the global south, I would be focused on these unequal power relations on a global level, but also regional and local. But from my perspective, what I research is the American empire and how it's integrated with global capitalism and how that has a globalizing influence, on the whole, basically every country in the world, how that affects all human life, basically, and even death. So that's sort of my big picture comments that I'd want to start with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. And absolutely, I mean, breaking down how this global process has taken root in the global south, I think when we attend to the different regions and particularly from our standpoint in the Middle East would generate, I think, very timely questions about how we conceptualize of the global, even at this point. Great. Seth.
Thank you, Inji, for the introduction and the invitation, and great to be here with you, both Amr and Sean. So I agree with what has been said already. I would also add that I think we need to introduce perhaps categories that are presented or processes that are presented as universal by modernization theory, which I think still underpins a lot of contemporary political economy. And we simply know that they're wrong. They're not universal. For me, the best example is one of my favorite books by Kalyan Shanyal. He's a Bengali economist, and he traces this process where peasants are dispossessed, they move to a city, and they never transform into an urban proletariat. And that's the kind of arc, right? The story that is told in modernization theory. Instead, they're suspended permanently in between these two positions, and Western sociology does not even have a term to define this population of people, this permanent suspension. between peasant and proletariat. And so that's just one example. And we encounter these people on a daily basis in cities of the world, right? In Delhi, in Cairo, in Lagos. And so we know they exist, and yet we don't have a name for them from Western sociology, and political economy does not really grapple with their existence. And so I think that's one example where you could say that a political economy from or for the global South could be more accurate and could inform political economy in general. But I would also say that we're in a kind of world-making moment at present. Whether we look back 20 years from now and say that 2026 is comparable to 1945 and 1989, who knows if we'll do that. But at the moment, it seems like a lot of the conventional wisdom from the past 20 years is gone, is thrown out the window. And I personally think that we're in a post-neoliberal world order. And so I think we need to understand the new world order that's emerging from a variety of perspectives, and certainly including from the global South. And the global South is huge, from MENA, from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, from East Asia. And so I think we need to, look at sorry, I'll wrap up here, but I have a lot more that I think we'll get into. But I would simply say that the last war in the Persian Gulf was animated by what people have called neoliberal geopolitics. That was kind of violently trying to draw Iraq into the singular global world economy, right? And there's an entirely different dynamic at play at the moment. And so I think that's what we really need to grapple with most urgently. This new dynamic is around the geostrategic creation of meta-geographies, mainly the American one versus the Chinese one. But the American one, of course, is the most imperialist at the moment. So it includes, of course, this, the attempt to create an alternative geography to the Belt and Road Initiative. That's how I understand what's happening in Southwest Eurasia. The kind of institutional framework is the IMEC. It was introduced at the G20, the India Middle East Economic Corridor. And in practice, what this means is producing iPhones and things in India and sending them to Europe and the rest of the world through Southwest Eurasia. And of course, this includes Israel, and that's part of the project, right, to integrate Israel within this geography. And so I think I'll end there. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack. Thanks again for having me.
I think your first point about the limits of Western epistemology, sociology, in that sense, and in how it shapes the way we define the global South, even in a discussion like this, is very well taken, and I think is even more urgent right now in March 2026. Some people would speak of this as perhaps questioning whether this is a 1956 moment for the United States, whether this perhaps hints at the dawn of America, or the end of or eclipsing of American empire in the region, or of these tensions, these geostrategic tensions coming head to head. I mean, this specific point about also the competition between the Chinese and American model, I'd love for us to unpack it, but I'm also interested in the tension there between this multiple neoliberalisms, or this multiple post-neoliberal world order, with not necessarily a multipolar world order, but rather not disfigured in the sense, but divided, and where that could potentially take us if we could still speak about a global model with all these divisions. I'm interested if you can all pitch in on this question. Yeah. We can follow the same order as well. So, or yeah.
Well, I think it's a bit too early to decide what kind of moment there is. So if we just like be very empirically conservative or reserved with what's happening, we can just like focus on the things that have already taken place. So we know that many of the rules, as Seth was saying, that we used to take as like common wisdom or conventional wisdom or whatever have gone away. That, of course, has made itself very clear before even the conflict or like the Israeli-American war on Iran, with the like open talk about like what was considered as a taboo under the new international law of like annexation, etc. This is becoming more mainstreamed. It's no longer just the case with the Russian in their neighborhood. The Israelis definitely have always been an anomaly or an exception or whatever. But now many of these practices are being mainstreamed by the very core. So if you think of the US president talking about committing war crimes, and he's just like saying so beforehand, even by saying that they would obliterate civilian infrastructure. So overall, I do agree that this is not exactly the neoliberal world, because the neoliberal world, to a great extent, and when it comes to this, I agree with both Seth and Sean, not only here, but in their writings as well, that this has depended to a great extent on the hegemonic role that the US has played, not only since the 1980s, but I would say we trace it back to the end of World War II. And even to some instances in World War or like in the interwar period. What is happening seems to be, I think, multiple crises. On the one hand, there seems to be a crisis that is hitting not only the neoliberal model, but I would say the foundations of the capitalist model of development, which remains at essence the one that modernization theory came up with in the late 40s and through the 50s, of like growth, the promise of mass consumption, etc. And of course, the planetary limitations that we are facing is something that would go way beyond imperialist hegemony, or the idea that we have some capitalist center that is rising and another one that has to share power and wealth with it, etc. That is on a big scale having to do with the reproduction of the order as a whole, really on a in a very globalized way. That's one thing. But then we have also the what seems to be like a fairly like a crisis of the order and the power relations that have enabled this order to reproduce itself under the U.S. hegemony. There is definitely a crisis in the U.S. internally. The political system seems to be showing so many signs of dysfunctionality, as well as economically. There are more and more vulnerabilities within, and especially there isn't much consensus on the role of the U.S. As an international power that has to dedicate resources, not only economic but military ones as well, for the reproduction of the international order. This is exactly what we are witnessing: is that this consensus has been broken, and we are, I think, on the verge of a consensus that is being formed in the U.S. Against the U.S. playing such a role. And this raises so many questions about: is there going to be some other hegemonic actor? And then we go into the Chinese not being willing, not being able, whether actually the Chinese are even considering this at all. And to be I actually don't think that they are capable of playing this role, and maybe nobody is capable of playing such a role, given that the price of such hegemony has just risen up. I think that what we are seeing with Iran, and what we have seen even more so with Ukraine, is that middle powers can challenge great powers to a great extent. We have just technological changes, we have other forms of limitations, and this makes the world more, I wouldn't say necessarily multipolar, but it makes it more prone to anarchy. The idea that whoever is hegemonic is not capable of and you can think of Iran, by the way. I think it's a very interesting case. Iran, of course, is a nation that has evolved in modern times through an extended process of semi-colonization, being an independent but not really independent country. And I think that this has been the complex that formed to a great extent the core of Iranian nationalism. whether in the leftist or in the Islamist form. And think of the earlier coups. I mean, like the UK could topple an earlier Shah and replace him with his son, with almost no cost amid World War II. And then think of Mossadegh. Like in the case of Mossadegh, it was mainly a conspiracy, like that was hatched by the CIA, and that's it. Look at how these things are happening now. The cost is rising because of like nationalism, because of a more distribution, like a fair distribution of access to technology, fairer distribution of access to technology, not necessarily fair. I mean, like more even, relatively speaking. So overall, these are all questions that we have about the future of the political economic order, and I think that we need to take it a bit farther from the rather simplistic discussion of who's coming next after the US, because maybe nobody is planning to come next after the US, and maybe the US itself is not thinking of resuming or of reproducing this kind of role.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I see two very big topics here in the question that you asked. So one question is what's going on with neoliberalism? And the other question is whether we have continuity or discontinuity in the world order. So maybe for some people that's a similar question, but for me, those are two actually quite different questions, because first of all, with neoliberalism, we have to figure out, what exactly we're talking about when we say neoliberalism, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So for example, I don't think the United States was ever neoliberal, right? So, I mean, Ronald Reagan is seen as the guy that started neoliberalism in the United States, or it was actually Jimmy Carter that ramped up interest rates with the Fed in 1979 before Reagan came in. But anyway, Reagan did a lot of protectionism. Like if you're Japanese in the 1980s, you don't see Ronald Reagan as a protector of the free market or free trade. You see protectionism, tariff wars, industrial policy. So for example, Ronald Reagan put 100% tariffs on Japanese semiconductors, did a $500 million industrial policy for semiconductors, using 14 American firms and the Pentagon. So so if we understand neoliberalism as a lack of state intervention or austerity or free markets, free trade, then that is what the United States imposed on the global South through, for example, the IMF and World Bank and so on, right? But the United States itself was never neoliberal. That was always propaganda and was always what they imposed on others. I mean, so you just look at a 50-year history of IMF structural adjustment programs. Whenever there's a financial crisis, the IMF, under pressure from the US Treasury and the Fed and so on, force over 150 countries to implement a structural adjustment program that cuts their government budget, that reduce tariffs, opens up trade, all this stuff. And then when the United States itself had a financial crisis in 2008, they of course did the exact opposite. They nationalized the banks, they nationalized the auto sector, they did the largest government stimulus since 1929, right? So the United States was never neoliberal. So I think we have to separate that. And I was very interested in Seth's comment in his previous answer that Gulf War II was sort of a neoliberal war. I'd be interested in, if we have time, to get into that a bit more. But I see, so on the other bigger topic of continuity or discontinuity, I see a lot of continuity. In fact, I see continuity going back to 1492. So I think the general world order is, starting in Western Europe, but then, of course, since 1945, you have American hegemony that took over from the former European imperialist powers. But you have a global capitalism that is now global, underpinned by American hegemony, that extracts resources from the global South. And so that's why I say that's been the case since 1492. So I see the current Gulf War III, if we want to call it that, I see that as continuity um, in this 500-year process of Western imperialism. And more specifically, I see this Gulf War III as what the neoconservatives in the United States and in Israel have been wanting. I mean, Bibi Netanyahu on March 1st, on Sunday, March 1st, he said he's been wanting this for 40 years. So going back to the 80s, if you look at the 1996 document, A Clean Break, which was for Netanyahu, but it has, obviously there's a lot of American Israeli dual citizens. So there are also Americans that wrote that report, A Clean Break. It's only 7 pages. You can read it online. But they laid out that, we first have to attack Hezbollah and Syria, Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and Saddam Hussein in Iraq, in order for us to then invade Iran. So they've literally been planning this for decades. So I see a lot of continuity. I just want to throw that out, that in some ways, the US was never neoliberal. That was only what they imposed on the third world. And in another sense, I see a lot of continuity in what's going on in the world right now.
Thank you, Sean, for this provocation. Seth, if you want to be good.
Yeah, tough acts to follow. I'm not going to go back to 1492, and instead I'm going to just try and I think I would make the case that we are in an entirely new order, because I think there's some tension there, or that the neoliberal order was something that I don't disagree with Sean's point that the US was never neoliberal. Neoliberalism to me is many things. It's an ideology, it's an order, political orientation, but still, I think we can see, in my view, a kind of order that it underpinned globally for many years, and that order has disintegrated. And I agree that we can find all sorts of contradictions along the way. So for me, what I mean when I say neoliberal order is this understanding that this understanding that a globally integrated single market is desirable, and then there's a set of institutions, and this relates to what Amr said about institutions and governance. There are a set of multilateral institutions that emerged, particularly after the Cold War. They became hegemonic, that served to integrate that market. And I think one of the fundamental things we have to recognize is that there was a kind of firewall between the electoral politics of countries on one side. So on the one hand, you would have people talking about the virtues of democracy, and usually they meant electoral democracy. You could, every few years, elect a leader, but that person was then faced this firewall. They were not permitted to influence market forces or distort market forces, you could say. So you had to then agree to these international institutions and World Trade Organization, for example, and World Bank and IMF. And I think no one would dispute that probably in this meeting. Fast forward to the present, I think the Biden administration did more than anyone else to undermine that structure, because the small yard, high fence really undermined that firewall. So think about it. What is the high fence? It's not the same firewall between democratic institutions or electoral democracy and economy. It's moving that high fence from between those two things to protecting the American economy, and particularly certain sectors like semiconductors, from international competition. And therefore, it's not even market forces that's going to decide winners and losers in these sectors that are deemed essential for national security. It's the Biden administration itself, or the US government now, right? And so it completely inverted neoliberalism, turned it on its head, in my view. And then that's why we see the introduction of all sorts of things like investment screening, everything Sean talked about in the 80s, but that's not an exception anymore. That's the rule, right? I think in the 1980s, surely all of those things that he mentioned with Japan, I don't dispute any of that, but I think now that is the rule. And so now we see, I think we enter maybe if you prefer state capitalism or state capitalist geopolitics, the geopolitical logic is entirely different. When I say neoliberal geopolitics, I'm referring very specifically to an article. It would appear in Antipode in 2002 by Susan Roberts, Matt Spark, and Sakor, and I think I'll share the link later. But they say that the geopolitical logic of the time was to forcefully draw countries into those multilateral frameworks and then impose upon them that firewall between electoral democracy or domestic institutions and then the global economy that they had to integrate with. And we definitely, I think we don't see that anymore. That's not the logic that's animating geopolitics. When you see the US kidnapping leaders in the middle of the night, that's not to draw the country into international institutions. It's really quite plainly imperialist, right? It's to steal oil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's an entirely different logic to the geopolitical to geopolitics at the moment, and I think we don't really have a name for it. And I would hesitate to give a name to this emergent order. I think it's just not the neoliberal one, right? And I think this relates to what Amr said. Maybe there is no country that's just coming along and going to be the next hegemon. The U.S. Has a different logic. It's playing by a different set of rules now. And I would say it's not only Trump. That's an easy explanation, right? Surely Trump is playing by a different set of rules, but as I just said, the Biden administration did more to undermine the neoliberal order than anyone else. And China, I think, also is not keen to just step into the breach, right? And to play this role of global hegemon. So now the US and China are indeed competing, but that's not competing for like the top slot in the global international order. It's a different type of competition, which I think we can get to probably later. But for now, I would talk instead of the neoliberal order. I'd say there's kind of state capitalist geopolitics at work, but without any sort of overarching order.
Yeah, this point about sure, Sean, please jump in.
Do you mind if I just lay out like maybe a difference in how we're understanding this? So whether you see, neoliberalism or a neoliberal world order as sort of the overarching order on this planet. So a lot of people see it that way. I don't. So I see US empire as the overarching concept here that's organizing global capitalism, right? So if that's what you're focusing on, US empire, then the US will do whatever it wants or whatever it needs in order to protect and promote its power. And so sometimes they'll do neoliberalism, sometimes they'll promote free trade, other times they won't. And it's not just the 1980s against Japan. I mean, I can go through, go through the whole post-1945 period, and then even the British as well. I mean, the British in the 19th century, they destroyed the textile industry in India, right? In order to develop it, where you're sitting right now in Manchester. So like there are always contradictions here. And so for me, the overarching concept should be empire, and then these second order concepts are basically instruments of imperial power and global capitalism.
So in 30 seconds, I'll respond. Sean, I don't disagree too much, but I would say that the overarching logic of how that power is organized is important, right? Whether that's through an internationally integrated global economy underpinned by neoliberal ideology or brute force. These are two very different ways to exercise power and to organize an empire. And so for me, it's significant that the US has switched. I mean, it tells me something about the weakening of US power. I think you disagree with that. But to me, the US is trying to renegotiate globalization, the terms and rules that had underpinned it for the past 25, 30 years, precisely because it's that those rules no longer ensured its continued domination. And so I do think that, sure, this is about US power without a doubt. But how US power manifests and organizes the global economy is not insignificant. And whether that's through a neoliberal, globally integrated political economy or some other way, like just take someone's oil, that's not insignificant.
So if I may, I think that one of the issues, we don't really disagree here. What I'm saying here is that like neoliberalism has been very uneven, if it is or if it ever was about the creation of free markets. it wasn't just the protectionist episodes against Japan or South Korea, or nowadays against China, but the very fact of opening markets has always been conditioned by sectors, by industries. So you have like whole sectors that have always been left out of the push for liberalization. That's one thing. There are other sectors that have always been left out of any regulation. So I think that in that sense, this gets us to the idea that is has often been made vague, I think, on purpose by the liberal, and later on the liberal imperialist discourse to a great extent. And here, you can think of the British Empire conquering different peoples and different territories in the name of bringing free trade to them. And I think that we can think of neoliberalism to an extent in the same light. The idea here, of course, is that the US is no longer that much committed because for some reason others have played by the rules that were set by the US and could make their way up the ladder. And that tells us about two things. On the one hand, that definitely state power has always been there in sustaining the creation of markets. I think that we all agree on this from an historical perspective, regardless of whatever liberalism might claim about markets being natural or being self-perpetuating or self-forming or whatever. That's one thing. And the other issue here is that there are limitations also on the ability of these states, if we think of them as empires or as imperialist actors, etc. Because again, in capitalism is very complex, and we have this high differentiation between capital and the state, and this is something that might explain a bit how the US has turned under globalization into the exporting of capital and the importing of capital, taking the financialization turn, the de-industry. All of these are seem to be more of class dynamics within the US in relation to the rest of the world as well. I mean, deindustrialization, the weakening of the working class. So, and I think that this is something that is militating now against the attempts at bringing back not only protectionism but economic nationalism, and not just by Trump, by the way. You trace it back to Biden. You trace it back even to Obama. The export bans on the highly advanced microchips is something that started under Obama. It's and the act was passed under the Democratic Party as not the Democratic Party, but I mean as a bipartisan act in times when they no longer cooperate on anything. So I think that what we are seeing here is on the one hand, of course, we have parts of this capital that are very concentrated, are increasingly being brought into the logic of geopolitics, especially with the military applications of technology, etc. But you also have other segments of this capital that are extremely powerful and that are not enabling the federal state to do what is required. You can think definitely of finance, the finance industry, and the kind of reaction that you had not only in the stock market but the bond markets when Trump imposed his tariffs. Not to mention, of course, that these tariffs went down the drain eventually because you have very powerful interests that are pushing back against this. So I would say that this is a factor that does not actually go against what you are saying. It just suggests a mechanism into understanding the decline, because the decline or the change, at least. I'm not sure whether this is a decline or not. I try not to give up to teleological thinking that this is eventually something that will happen in the future. This is extremely dangerous and sometimes very inaccurate. But maybe also understanding capital as a factor in its own right, and then these states as capitalist imperialist states can get us into conceiving of a more dynamic way of seeing this.
This is a perfect segue actually into our next segment, and maybe perhaps grounding it more into the global south today, China today, the I mean, if we want to call it a second Cold War, the China-US trade war, but also the role that China plays in the global South vis-a-vis this US-led global capitalism. We're already getting questions in the chat about these alternative paths of South-South cooperation or ways out for the global South. So I wanted to pick your brain on this, particularly that we've been speaking around China, and we can tackle it head on now. And in relation to this just imaginaries, but also perhaps practices of South-South cooperation, BRICS plus or otherwise, as a way to navigate these power, trade, and financial asymmetries of US-led global capitalism. So, and Sean, if you'd like to lead us on this.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I argue that the capitalist rise of China has made the United States more powerful. So the way in which China has risen since the 1990s has increased US power in certain ways. And I think the current war in the Persian Gulf demonstrates how weak and, in my opinion, useless China is in trying to be a leader of the global South and so on. So, so first of all, so Xi Jinping presents himself or China as a leader of the global South and sort of the primary evidence that we live in a multipolar world order. So Xi Jinping has says many times in speeches now for since 2020 or whatever, that we now already live in a multipolar world order, and so we're finally over unipolarity. We're over U.S. hegemon. He used the word hegemonism, and we're entering a world in which other states, the BRICS plus or whatever, have more of a say. But I think the complete. I mean, China's not doing anything to provide any kind of counterbalance to the United States right now in the Persian Gulf. And I think that is because China is so dependent on international trade, on semiconductors, on electronics, on petroleum, not just for, so as a share of its total energy mix, petroleum is actually one of the lowest now of any major country, but they rely on petroleum for their production as an input for all plastics, semiconductors, etc. So China is highly vulnerable and dependent on the US-centered global capitalist system. And so that is why, for example, China abstained in United Nations Security Council Resolution 2817, which was passed on March 11th, which was brought by Bahrain on behalf of the Gulf Cooperation Council to condemn Iran for its strikes on the Gulf, and it said nothing about the U.S.-Israeli starting the war and starting the bombing in the middle of their negotiations with Iran. So, China abstained. And China also abstained with United Nations Security Council Resolution 2803 from November of last year, which approved Trump's Board of Peace, for redevelopment in Gaza. China and Russia, both cases, of course, China and Russia have abstained. And so they're not, Iran is supposed to be a member of the BRICS now, but there is no solidarity. There's no attempt to actually challenge U.S. hegemony. The only one challenging the U.S. hegemony right now is Iran, right? Not China and the others. And I think it's because China is so weak, and it's entirely, when it talks about a multipolar world order and so on, it's entirely empty rhetoric, and it's not backed by any actions at all.
Thank you for this. If we're also thinking about the choke point, the Strait of Hormuz, and the de-dollarization that's being pushed there, perhaps I think that was also laying heavily on some minds in terms of that being an opening or an unintended consequence of the war. But also, you're right, like the institutions that would be able to not only support this, but institutionalize this process, right? Or that it's not a one-off thing by one ship passing by, but a much larger infrastructure, financial infrastructure. I mean, and on that front, Seth has been, you've been thinking a lot about the Second Cold War, the new consensus, both through domestic changes in the US and in China. What do you think of this, not only through this current inflection point, but also, going forward?
Yeah, I think I would start in a different place. I would start from Sean. Rather than looking at this event, I would take a step back and think about what are China's objectives. That might explain why it's acting in certain ways with regard to the war going on right now in the Persian Gulf. Some people will talk about debt traps. That's been completely debunked, I would say. Other people will point to China's attempt to project a sense of stability, almost like a status quo power in relation to the US that's now tearing down the international order. I would argue that the US and China are engaged in a competition to renegotiate globalization. So that's my starting point. And I would locate the roots of this conflict in the domestic politics of both countries. I think most people are familiar with probably more people are familiar with the domestic politics in the US than in China. So, the 2008 financial crisis precipitated a big backlash, and we got the Tea Party, and that evolved into Donald Trump and propelled him into office and so on. So that's one side of the story. But probably fewer people are familiar with the politics going on in China at the time. And in 2008, it was an equally important moment in China. So this was during the Hu Jintao era, and the party state had become very close to the capitalist class for the preceding 15 years or so, I would say. So one of the most famous capitalists in China, Jack Ma, you probably know him. He's the founder of Alibaba. He was a card-carrying member of the China Communist Party. And that might be surprising to many people. And it was certainly something that that engendered grievances among a number of sectors of the population in China. Because what good is a communist party if the country's most successful capitalist is a member? So certain sectors of the population that were upset at the time were workers in state-owned enterprises, who your state-owned enterprise was responsible for your welfare. They ceased to exist, right? They were collapsing. There were migrant workers. These are people that moved typically from west to east, but they didn't have the right to live in cities in the southeast. So they were perpetually second-class citizens. This is the kind of footloose laborers you'd hear about. And then, of course, the peasantry, for whom urbanization was not a signal of progress. It was an oncoming train, right? And it was threatened dispossession and so on. So I think Xi Jinping, when he came to power in 2012, realized that there was a looming legitimacy crisis that the party state faced. And so he tried to reestablish a social contract. And a lot of what he has done, I would interpret as that. That includes the anti-corruption drive. That includes the so-called China Dream, which is a bit of a flexible concept, but basically it kind of doubles down on the role that the state will play in terms of engendering growth and who that will benefit. And then, of course, this concept of national rejuvenation. And that's quite important. So that includes the foreign policy element of this new social contract in Xi Jinping's plan to circumvent a legitimacy crisis. The national rejuvenation is quite similar in some ways, in some respects, to Make America Great Again. It relies on this imagined past, right? An imagined past that probably never really existed. But it's a politics of grievance. In this case, it's a grievance globally for the 100 years of humiliation. And it's incompatible with the policy of the US that underpins Make America Great Again. And so we see within a decade, US and Chinese foreign policies went from being complementary, where China would make things, US companies would set up factories there, the capital that was accumulated would be recirculated into US treasuries and so on, in this kind of symbiotic relationship, into an antagonistic relationship where they're pursuing foreign policies that are not complementary at all. And in fact, they both can't national rejuvenation cannot be achieved if America is quote unquote great again, and vice versa. And so I think they're now competing for not to undermine globalization, but they're competing for the key networks that constitute globalization. And in my view, the transnational networks that are most important that they're competing for are infrastructure. So we see the Belt and Road Initiative. The US is hopelessly behind in this field. Production, not production of everything, but certain key production networks like semiconductors, that's already been mentioned. Amr mentioned that, I think, and other ones as well, electric vehicles and so on. Financial networks and digital networks. And I think energy is somehow could be incorporated within those, or you might think of it separately, but that's obviously an important one. So these are the centrality in these networks then will determine the meta-geographies of how space will be organized rather than one single global economy, but they will compete in different ways. And then that moves on to how other countries can respond, or in what ways will they respond to that competition. So the countries that will win are the ones that can bridge in these networks and can somehow manage to maintain relations with the US and China. The IMF talks about these as connector countries. And I don't like that term because it's not clear what they're connecting. But let's be clear. These are Chinese producers and American consumers, right? So Vietnam, for example, Mexico. And they have to somehow the foreign policies of those countries, the game that they're playing is to try and figure out how to prevent the US from imposing tariffs and maintain good relations with China and so on. But then I think also, let's be clear, the last 30 years or so of neoliberalization has disempowered governments in many countries. So it's not just something that governments can decide. It's their capitalist classes that are also integrated with the US and China, right? And so even if a leader comes to power and decides they want to align exclusively with the US or China, that would be rather difficult, if not impossible in most countries, because their capitalist classes are connected to the two largest countries in the world, the two countries with the two largest economies in the world. So I call this polyalignment, along with some of my colleagues. We've been writing on this, and this is not just a foreign policy orientation; it's a de facto condition, right? And so I think the question then for me is that I would be asking is how can countries remain polyaligned in a way that benefits them, and how can they kind of cement themselves in networks and be these connector countries and benefit from their connections from both the US and China while not exposing them to the risks that entails, right? So that Donald Trump doesn't wake up on the wrong side of bed and say, well, you've got this relationship with China, and so I'm imposing a 40% tariff tomorrow, and just send that off on Truth Social. That would be the question that I would be asking myself if I were the president of a country in the global south.
I want to take us to Egypt on the multiple threads that you shared, but especially on the geographic, not only realignment, but the remaking of the map of the Middle East, and also Egypt is particularly attaching itself to the BRI through the Suez Canal zone with Chinese investments, while at the same time remaining firmly within the US camp, if we want to call it that. So, Amr Adli, if you want to give us an overview of your perspective on Egypt's connection to China, relationship with China, especially when it comes to also BRICS and as a way to navigate this global landscape.
Well, I think that you mentioned already the key points in how Egypt has been dealing with the economic rise of China, like being invited to BRICS, like the increasing Chinese investments. But in the meantime, it's something that also shows us again, I don't want to use a teleological concept like transitional. But the fact that China has risen significantly, and here I agree a lot with what Seth was saying, because the Chinese did redefine their mode of insertion into the global division of labor, something that so many countries in the global south could not do. They could upgrade in a way that is like similar to other cases in Northeast Asia, But the issue is, of course, with scale, that China could do this with such a big scale in a way that is likely to redefine the global economy, because basically China is too big to fit into the American order. So back to Egypt here, we are witnessing the same thing, that if you take a look at FDI stocks, for instance, you will still have like a big presence of the US, of European capital. Same goes with the trade partnership, but also the rate at which growth of trade with China, of investment from China, as well as other new centers of export, of capital exporting, like the GCC, which is, of course, like something that's very problematic given the current context, like about where these guys fit exactly into the current disorder. But so it is a sign that you still have China moving up the ladder within an order that is still dominated by the US. But then again, as Sean was saying, and here I tend to agree with him, that like is China a player other than being the most important trade partner and the investor with the like most probably the highest rates of growth of foreign direct investment, and sometimes even portfolio investment, especially in if we are thinking in terms of like development, like debt / aid, how it relates, we don't exactly understand this. I don't exactly understand it. If we think of this, it stops here, because what role is China even offering to play when it comes to, I wouldn't say a direct military presence, but even like look at like whether China would be committed to like the armament or technology transfer to a country like Iran. Iran seems to be quite like isolated when it comes to its strategic relations with China, and I would say even with Russia, especially that the Russians have a lot to gain out of the ongoing war. Maybe this has changed their tactical positioning. But like overall, I think that these are signs of some form of transformation, to use a word that is safer than transition, because we have no idea exactly about the destination. But there is some transformation here. I think we have like some bottlenecks about the role that could be played, basically having to do with the financialization of the global economy that has become, I would say, next to bombs, the two most important tools that the US has retained. The idea that the dollar is so significant, is so important, and the Chinese, at the end of the day, are accumulating their trade surpluses basically in dollars. And when they are not buying bills and bonds, like last year, by the way, they have been like divesting from US public debt. But then you have reports that captured like greater investment in US stocks, for instance. So it's again, it gets us to if you accumulate trade surpluses, they translate into some form of assets. If these are financial assets that are traded globally, they have to be denominated in dollars. But eventually, and I don't want to get into details here, but eventually we can't have this financial economy that is completely separated from the real economy. I mean, like the US overall weight has declined, even in relation to the Middle East, by the way. The US is not economically that powerful in the Middle East. It's not that important, even when it comes to the exporting of oil. I mean, like you could already see that the main trade partners and the Middle East, of course, only exports oil and natural gas. I mean, this is its position in the global division of labor, and the destination is made basically to South Asia and to East Asia. So the point here is that the Middle East here is a case in point, is that the US is redefining its relationship with the Middle East mainly through military means. It's not that it has not engaged before with military means, but it had other tools as well. And it seems to have become only related to the region through the direct or indirect supply of violence. Of course, they are not the only suppliers of violence. You have so many suppliers of violence from the region itself, but I mean like that they are the ones that are capable, together with the Israelis, of course, and the Israelis are an extension at the end of the day to the US imperialist intervention in the region. So this is a sign of something that is not exactly going well, I would say.
I just wanted to give a warning to my new Egyptian friends here. So I can certainly understand why Egypt would want to play both sides, so have a very deep security relationship with the United States and also join the BRICS Plus and so on. But China does not provide an alternative. So if you look at the recent history of Pakistan, Pakistan was the largest recipient of Belt and Road Initiative funds. So you have the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor to develop a new pipeline to Gwardar Port and so on. So then Pakistan had its largest financial crisis, in recent memory. And China didn't do any sort of bilateral loan renegotiation or whatever. They just punted to the IMF. So the IMF comes in and does a vicious structural adjustment program in Pakistan. And, you have they cut energy subsidies, and you have massive food inflation and everything. I mean, people probably died in Pakistan. And why? Because China also wants its money back, right? So they just punted to the IMF. So it's not an alternative. China is a fair weather friend, and so if you're hedging with both the U.S. and China, in my opinion, it's not going to work. So what needs to be done, I think, is to recreate something like a non-aligned movement, which of course also has a history in Egypt with Nasser and so on, and the United Arab Republic. I think you have to have a non-aligned alternative from the U.S. and China, because, like I said, China is deeply integrated in U.S. capitalism, and that has not changed. Thank you.
Great. I mean, this question, we already have two questions on alternatives. The concluding questions I had were also about alternatives, not as a vision for the future or predicting this very complex moment that the world and particularly the region is in. But I'll summarize the two questions that we received and also ask you to, in your reflections, tell us, in your opinion, what are two events, factors, processes that we should keep an eye out on with the current changes and with the current war, but also with the ongoing, of course, genocide and changes since 2023. So we have a question about the extent to which global South countries have real alternatives to the current neoliberal international legal framework, particularly institutions like the IMF and the World Trade Organization. And we kind of touched upon this, but the second part of the question is whether there's a genuine way out or only ways to navigate within it. I think, Sean, your point about non-aligned movement, harkening back to that moment in history, this new global South consensus, perhaps you could expand on that as well. And the second question is about regionalization and integration as an alternative to dependency, whether regionalization and integration would be alternative to dependency on global hegemon's dominance of the multipolar order, not necessarily as a way out, but a way to navigate and feel more secure in the collective. Perhaps this would be a moment of clarity and revisiting global South regional organizations. So yeah, and we can follow the order if we want to start with Amr, Sean, Seth.
Well, let me pick the thread, because I agree with Sean that just like sitting on our hands, like hoping that some other hegemon will take over or whatever, would just like make us depend too much on the Chinese plans. Maybe the Chinese have basically plans for Taiwan and the South China Sea. Maybe China, as like a hegemon, will remain a regional issue. Maybe capitalism on a global scale has become so complex and disruptive to the extent that not one single core will be capable of providing the public goods that were needed, including like basic governance, etc., which has always remained very shaky on an international level. I mean, so the question, of course, is that what kind of order might come up And then we face the problem in the global south that, unlike the good old days of dependency theory that used to refer to the periphery or to the third world, if we are talking about the non-alignment movement, back then, development could be rather, well, I would say uniformly approached as the challenge to move away from these like colonial dependent agrarian economies into some form of industrialization. Nowadays, things are not that simple. It's not only that we have China, and it has been very hard ever since China acceded the WTO, not because of acceding of the accession to the WTO. I mean, like this was the moment of reckoning to a great extent, whether China is still part of the third world or not. And you have the joke about the G77 asking China to join them, and then China asked them to join it in return. Like given, of course, the weight and the kind of divergence of interest. So that's a major challenge. You have also the problems, and again, like the region here is a case in point. Like regions, not only the Middle East and to a lesser extent North Africa, but you can think also of the Sahel in Africa, the Horn of Africa. These are regions that are becoming very unstable. Added to this, I would say Eastern Europe. That is also something that is becoming unstable. And overall, these put together, they raise questions even about the ability of governments to agree on some basic arrangements, for the provision of their security, not to mention some measurement of or some measure of regional integration, etc., especially in such heightened times of uncertainty. So all of these, I think we have the right question, but whether, like, do we have the answer or not? That is the issue, and I don't see much that would make me optimistic, at least for our part of the world.
Do you want Seth to go? I mean, I feel like I just talked twice without Seth talking.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Sean. Yeah, all right. So first of all, I wanted to respond very briefly to this point. I think I take Sean's point that if you are the president of a country in the global south, aligning with China may not be an answer because China is a fair weather friend. And I would just point out that I think there are a number of reasons why China is not keen to get drawn into a war in the Persian Gulf and isn't coming to Iran's aid. Suddenly the Arabic just okay, good. Sorry. So I mean, sorry. Yeah, keep in mind that Iran is not the only country with good relations in the region to China. China has also good relations with other Persian Gulf countries. I mean, it maintains relations with Israel as well. So it's not going to necessarily jump right into this war to help Iran. And although it's clear that it's not happy with what the U.S. and Israel are doing, but the U.S. doesn't. The U.S. can lose this war by itself, right? I mean, I think that is what people in Beijing are thinking. I don't think anyone in Beijing is sitting around worried about the decline of China's power in the region, because it's very clear that the U.S. is not going to somehow manage to just re-network this region in ways that fully support its interests. So, all right, what then? I guess, do countries have alternatives if it's not to align with China or align exclusively with the U.S.? I think it's worth keeping in mind that, in my view, a non-aligned movement wouldn't really work at the moment, right? So if you remember what the non-aligned movement really was. Think of the Sukarno speech in Bandung. It started with the notion that countries needed to keep both the US and the Soviet Union at arm's length. So aligning with one or being drawn into their rivalry was a risk for countries that had little power, many of which were newly independent. So they risked being drawn into great game politics. And second, they had a responsibility, Sukarno said, because they needed to foster world peace, right? They had just been decolonized, and they needed to then bring this understanding of colonialism to bear for the purpose of fostering world peace. Now it's entirely different. What every country wants is more of everything: more trade, more aid, more investment. What I see global South countries asking for from both the US and China is, don't make us choose. We want deeper connections with both of you, right? And that's the exact opposite of keeping them both at arm's length. We just talked about Egypt. It's integrated with both the US and China, and it wants more integration in all ways from both. And so I don't anticipate countries getting together and not aligning. I think instead what we might see, what one of the people asked in the chat, sorry, I didn't know the name, is that we might see regional blocks emerge. And I could envision that to an extent, but I don't think that they would be autarkic in any way from the US and China. It would just be that you might establish some sort of regional agreements, because we're going to see a pretty tricky time approaching with regard to, as we all know, energy, food security, and so on. So you might see some countries establishing some sort of institutions to help one another in times of trouble. But that's a far cry from non-alignment, and I'm a bit pessimistic on this point. Over to you, Sean.
Okay. Yeah, well, maybe let me step back to the question of capitalism to start winding down. If we do not fundamentally transform global capitalism, then our human existence is being threatened by the system that is prioritizing, endless accumulation for endless profit. We're coming up on finite resources. We're increasingly destroying our environment, and so on and so forth. And the particular version of global capitalism that we have is centered on the United States, and the United States is the most violent country, certainly in the last 80 years. And if we do not decouple from this system, so if we integrate with this system, if we do not not only decouple but defeat this system, then human survival is at stake. And I would just point to the Twitter feeds of the US tech oligarchs here, like Elon Musk and so on. Their plans, like 15 years ago, their plans were to build bunkers in New Zealand to hide from the apocalypse, but they've even abandoned that. Their plans now are interplanetary colonization. Elon Musk is talking about occupying Mars and AI destroying hundreds of millions of jobs. So I think just on their own statements, drug-infused statements, they don't expect humanity as we know it to persist for, definitely not the next 100 years, but maybe not the next couple decades. So they're already making their escape plan to literally go off into space. So I think we have to get real and think about what we need to do to fundamentally transform global capitalism. And that will not be done by integrating into global capitalism, whether that's China or any other country, because as soon as you integrate into this system, you're dependent on U.S. dollar, U.S. technology, you're not dependent on U.S. military, but you're certainly being threatened by U.S. military. Just to go back to what Amir said about China's ownership of treasury bills. So actually, from what we can tell, the ownership of Chinese overall ownership of treasury bills has actually increased. So what's happening is it's been redirected to Belgium and Luxembourg and maybe even the UK. And also state-owned banks are holding US dollars now more and more. So if you combine the People's Central Bank of China and Chinese state-owned banks, their holdings have actually increased. So China is funding US imperialism against China, for example. China is funding the US sending arms to Taiwan. So Trump last year in 2025, he sent more military weapons to Taiwan than ever before. So again, there's no hope for humanity if we continue to integrate into this global capitalist system centered upon U.S. empire. We must decouple from it and ultimately disintegrate the system itself and create something new, completely new. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This marks the end of our discussion, but just this one discussion. I'm sure there will be more. Thank you so much to the speakers for your invaluable insights, for a very rich and debate as well. I'm sure we all are leaving with more questions, but also more directions to look into. And yeah, we'll be following the news and maybe reconvening again in a couple of weeks to reassess the state of global capitalism, but also in the Middle East and the Global South. Thank you again to the attendees, to our partners at APSN. In the chat, you'll find some resources, links to APSN's publications and our website as well, Pathways Beyond Neoliberalism's website. Please check them out, and we look forward to our second session in April. Thanks again, everyone, and to our speakers.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Fantastic. Thank you.